Nyeden Nyedra Namda Rapsrave Chinye Dungun Chichen Zech Nije Tugra Lebunze Kunda Sibe Zunra Amare Mentam Dungre Chizeve Drozoi Kundai Puje Tarz Yinlai Tuje Yungde Son Drodare Chedro Nyumoy Nyelo Leje Chavro Indronze Jena Mare Mesre Dungre Nyugu Chinye Chenze Raje Nam Dene Daji Saju Darze Yunden Luzo Jase Tuviku Chundrai Chudai Chunye Jende Dale Mese Jambe Yung Lai Du Sedene Chije Jenrai Uzreje Dale Demo Menba Rapsrane Kadan Tenje Jungdoi Tokbaye Doje Pape Nova Sardu Solo Namda Tsudem Serje Saje Den Tenzen Pame Reling Kebeze Sherab Nyede Nongwe Chokan Sare Tumchon Drove Lama Shage Yulu Jamya Shana Dorje Jenreze Saye Nyimbo Deva Nam Prasar Namge Nyimbo Shambai Kundu Zon Nyeve Sejen Je Layen Gusha Salo Sheje Kala Chinra Chen Kuraje Zebe Udon Durje Len Lapo Yarve Tenbai Kune San Zebe Kayu Rinpoche Chela Shaje O Serab Gundu Sije Tanye Le Tamke Samye Shage Yung Zong Shen Changzhe Nyembe Langken Karma Pa Mishe Debe Chiwe Tsuge Tu Laso Ta Tarin Kashu Singen Tsangma Lola Tashi Deles Thoma Shubi
Khenpo Rinpoche begins by wishing all the viewers welcome to this course.
Tatrine Songde Tene Weekend Kashe Girin La Tene Tanda Sheg Chu Te Jase Lalin Soda Mashukin Ti Gen Makam Shugin.
So the topic of this series of lectures is that of what a bodhisattva does, how a so-called bodhisattva trains and acts or conducts himself.
Teyinde Talalin Sodoma Shukin Tenchunde Hajan Yebu Mare Tenchu Duduchre Sholoka Jip Shesam Mato Mesh.
And in the text, there are 37 practices listed in this regard. However, and I should say, each of the practices is set forth in a 4-line verse in the Tibetan original manuscript. In the English, it's not always 4 lines. So each of the 37 practices is set forth by way of a verse. Then there are some additional verses. 2 in the introductory part, and the remaining ones at the end of the text. So all in all, one finds 43 verses. Dadi shloka di Shloka Triyong di nyenga son shiki tsishi ergo.
Marichidan dirila, sholoka si driya de, ta jagane tsambe, tinchu tsawa rabu mangchewa tali sholoka si drik nangdo.
Laso.
Sholoka si drik goya de, sholoka tende si drik chana, ngame tu na, tinchu ndezo mangchewa lo ling gogo yorobala. Lo ling degi yusare. Penna kap tedi shogu yang kale kabure, tene parjeya da pazay tsuzerwa. Tene ti indu tinchu pe nyungrwa. Tsawa chikla ina. Ten loto ne nisong gogo yusare. Mangchewa chwe te loto nisong gogo yusare.
Now, in terms of the style, in the style of writing, namely in 4-line verses, in Sanskrit called shlokas. Now, a shloka is a quarter verse where each line is made up of either 8 or 16 syllables. Now, one has to consider the Indian subcontinent at the time, and the fact that the only manuscripts available of any text, because at the time of the beginnings of Buddhism, the art of printing had not yet happened on the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, handwritten copies were the only copies available. And if one considers how extensive the body of Buddhist scriptures is, one can imagine there wouldn't have been many handwritten copies of each. Therefore, Buddhist practitioners did not have access to printed copies. And for this reason, both the teacher and the disciples would have memorized the texts that were taught. So, in a course where a specific subject was taught, it would be the case that the guru who taught and explained the text in question did so on the basis of having memorized the text, and the students or disciples taking the course would also have memorized the text in question, in that copies were not widely available. So it became a tradition in terms of teaching situations, a tradition that both guru and disciples had memorized the text taught. And for the sake of making it easy to memorize a text, the composition of it would be a composition of shlokas, quarter verses, with either 8 or 16 syllables. When memorizing, that type of composition is easier to memorize. So there would always be a so-called root text, the basic text, written in quarter verses, for the sake of making memorization easy. And then the Guru, the Lama, teaching or elucidating the text in question, would give the additional explanations. So one has to keep in mind the reason for this type of literary composition in quarter verses. Tsiksena kodra ye am Chödrak. Ige mareta.
Oh, okay.
Tetsi. Inna shitkana. Det na 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Inna gore du pöig nangla. Det inna yang rere drare du kangi.
Bendi rere la sholoka chik segmarwa.
Ore det shuma dere du gan. Där junika. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Det la yangu. Da pöig tese kaka.
Dede. Pöig la sholoka diktan la. Sik dönse deba diktan chiktan. Sholoka mare sikje la. Sikje good diktan che ta chi yor lecture la.
Ge dan chudu se du da det singsen la. Ne pa net kela ter. Sanskrit.
Kanda yin ngamishi. Ta yu shutete ngan zabamto. Ta teche yondu.
Well, we could say that.
Ta tanda yusha.
Yeah, okay.
Ta te che tu penna tendege lol lembe shagyun te tu tata yang bög trasa chenpo sola yöde vare. Penna semri ya ki sholoka tongcham kanse shodep tongcham mongbo lol sem yug tende chegidoa shagyun.
Now, this tradition of memorizing texts is still at hand in Tibetan Buddhist monastic educational institutions, where part of the training is to memorize the texts taught, not just the root text or the basic text, which sums up the contents of a commentary to it, but the commentary as well is memorized in those Tibetan Buddhist educational institutions. So a student would, in terms of the higher levels of education, have memorized thousands of pages.
Yin nangdön rikpe kor pasha pö nangdön rikpa. Nangdön rikpe kor pasha pö pena min lobjong chit nangpa yin na yang. Min yu yisen kenten zo lo mandro na
yu shi ere.
Yu yire. Peche emchi tenle yang tsuye kala khabure.
Emchi kante?
Emchi ki tralle tsuye. Ten kala khabu yore. Te kare se na minga yigi nan la sona digma res lotol gogre se kanga.
Now, in terms of Tibet, if we look at another field of knowledge, that of Tibetan medicine, there the texts setting forth this field of knowledge, the basic texts are for medical tantras, as it were, or 4 tantras setting forth this field of knowledge, that of medicine. There as well, this tradition is upheld. So a Tibetan doctor would commit to memory. Dadi tongta kashiang ijirwa.
Peje yujil sholut katong kanse shodep ta injing tangachen tongta chikse yujure.
At least 1,000 pages. And the purpose of this is the following, namely that one commits to memory, one keeps in one's mind the instructions concerning the field of knowledge one studies, instead of leaving the instructions in the text, as it were, and having to go back each and every time in order to know what the instructions would be in a specific context. That's no longer necessary. The Buddhist Lama, whether Khenpo or otherwise, as well as the Tibetan doctor, would immediately know the instructions regarding the context he's faced with. He would not have to go to a library or his bookshelf, find the text in question, and then go from there trying to figure out this or that. And all of these people explain this by saying, if you leave your knowledge in the text which sets forth the topic, then at a time when you need the knowledge in question, it's not at hand, because you haven't committed it to memory. You would have to find the publication in question, go through the publication and then find the specific context and go from there. Khenpo Rinpoche explains that when he trained in Buddhist education, this was the norm then as well, namely that one had to commit the texts to memory, one had to memorize the texts that one studied.
Memory te pe jobu chesan kadu ina ye pa keyung.
Khenpo Rinpoche says about himself that he doesn't think he has a very good memory. And therefore, from time to time, there is a bit of a problem, he says, regarding having knowledge of something on the spot, as it were.
Tene, that into that Yasser Lalin Sinkende, some monkey Lama the Surisana. Togme Zangpo.
Now, the author of this short text what a Bodhisattva does in 37 practices is Togme Zangpo, a Tibetan Buddhist master of old, also known as Ngulchu Togme.
Chongsa de pearl chongre, chongbe du sir rabote, chilo chikton ninja, guchukonga lo kong chongsha, chongsek sanete, pearla u, zang kam ge yewa che yon de gabla zong nang la, kong chongdo, Tsongne yang densa shimbo Sakya ge Lonu rabo jigi sho ta Sakya na ta tong tong yinkin longba Puljung seki jigi nangla hong chung sha.
Sakya gonpa Khenpo chikin sarwa.
Rede Sakya gonpa tala tesegre. Tanda behaviour dorje den nipa segre.
Behaviour dorje den nipa.
Ta dorje den tangpot yaga le yor.
Now, Togme Zangpo was born in 1295 in the village of Puljung, located in the Tsang-Region. Now, all Tibet was divided into 3 regions, Yu, Tsang, and Kam. And he was born in that village of Puljung, which is not far from a larger Sakya monastery. Of quite some importance, called the second Bodh Gaya of Tibet, simply because apparently this monastery houses many Buddhist art objects, ancient scriptures, and so on from the Indian subcontinent, more than any other monastery in Tibet, hence the name. At any rate, Togme Zangpo was born not far from this monastery in the Tsang-Region.
Ta yin na yang ta khung thong ne gong lo sum la sembe ka la korang ge mayam te kusha song to. Oh yeah, ti me in jiro. Oh yeah, ta on
Now, Togme Zangpo's mother, unfortunately, passed away when he was just 3 years old.
Tene kong gong lo nga ka la yab yang sha song to.
And again, at the age of just 5, his father passed away.
Tinde jig chen chen ne ta korban de dungal ba shi gran yin ba me ta pa yin ba tan de le tar be tap ji se go do gong gong ji tu le yang ne yang do kor de ne ta chi pa ji re sha.
Even though just a child, Togme Zangpo, because of the passing of both his parents, he realized that everything in the world is impermanent, and that impermanence results in suffering. He thought to himself, there must be some way I can go beyond this. I must free myself of this situation.
Ta pamani chongdu chong ba yin sa ta khong shang chong de ta to ching ken de a shang de ge nang de yin sa re.
Now, an uncle of his cared for him after the deaths of his parents.
Tene a shang gun de ne khong ge yi ge tie de ye phog da da kang ga lo dang re sha.
And the uncle educated the young child in reading, writing, grammar, and the like.
Te chene, tene gonglo kyonye kala, achang la korang songne, kong tene rab shongwa reisha.
Kongrang ashang la shune, yang mena ashang ma kanang re.
Achang gile korang ke tatakwa shugi yusare, korwa le tuyo gobundu nga rab shongge yinse. Tene ayang ke tachana rab shongna tata reisa, rab shong tachi chachen chasang nang che dulo da, tenzo kanka tarik che ne, samling se gamba ti nang la rab shongwa reisha.
Samling Sakya Gompa.
Sache gamba chi sare.
Now, apparently, throughout this period, while in the care of his uncle, Togme Zangpo had frequently told his uncle that he wanted to take monastic ordination in order to go beyond yet another rebirth in yet another worldly existence with its impermanence and suffering. Now, when Togme Zangpo had become 15 years old, the uncle therefore had told him that he also thought that this would be a good thing to do, and he provided him with the monastic robes and other necessities for a monastic way of life, and brought him to the nearby Samling monastery of the Sakya school in order to take monastic ordination.
Ota tedi kongi traversin tela zongbo pal stando.
Zangpo Tal.
Zongbo pal.
Pal. And in terms of monastic ordination, the novice monk or nun is given a monastic name, and Togme Zangpo on this occasion was given the name Zangpo Pal.
Ta dene gombate da ta nyebori yusare e zula kong se tante sakya gomba cheshu chite e zula kong la dene pene ta lobjong gonggo te zugdu.
Not far from this monastery, there was yet another Sakya monastery, Iyi Tsuglakang, with a Buddhist educational institution, a monastery of a large size with various departments, it seems. And Togme Zangpo traveled there and entered the Buddhist educational institute of Iyi Tsuglakang.
Tatla gong nishu tsagu pado lobjon nong di jude.
Sabshi?
Tsagu.
Tsargu.
29.
And he remained there at this educational institute till the age of 29.
Tati yu ka pe mesi ba rikpa nyurbo. Tene yong khan la yang tokpa me ba kani song na song chocho rabu chi yosare.
And it became evident during his education there that he was an individual of a very high capacity in terms of comprehending and assimilating the knowledge in terms of the various levels of education available there. He was known as a student who quite rapidly was able to commit to memory the texts, commit to memory the explanations of these texts and so on and so forth.
That the Pede Kono country chicken do, Kane to what Tangshan, talk by Chunimendux.
Apparently, he didn't seem to have any limitations as to knowledge of both the Buddhist sutras and the Buddhist tantras.
Then this songs are Yongtra Kungla, Togme Zangpo, Semin Tosong.
And thus he became known as Togme Zangpo. Togme is short for Tokpa, which means unhindered or without limitations. And Zangpo means good. So he was nicknamed Togme Zangpo in consequence of having displayed that his knowledge of what he had studied had no limitations.
Yankabra Kung Tsin, the day second, Togme Sarva second.
Togme kare?
Togme Sarva.
Sarva? Kaina Sarva?
That Togme Nibate, Papa Tomeroa. Yagal Peveke.
Yeah.
That did talk much in their turn.
Sanskrit Kahingo. Asanga. Now, in terms of Indian Buddhist history, and one of the greatest Buddhist masters ever on the Indian subcontinent, the noble Asanga, they shared the name Togme. Asanga de Togme Gisikre do Asanga.
Take much in the Kana and Togme.
Mare. Yigi tola. Asanga means, translated into Tibetan, is Togme, unhindered or without limitations. So, Togme Zangpo at Tsuglakang became known as the recent Asanga, the new Asanga. So, in the minds of those at that large Buddhist educational institute, Togme Zangpo was seen in terms of his achievements as to knowledge of both the Buddhist sutras and the Buddhist tantras comparable to the noble Asanga, that Indian Buddhist master.
Yin Koranke, Tudon Nekapgun to Yamin Himpote, Dajin Yambaton, Dajin Yewa, Sonchip Semkona, Yamin Nangi.
Now, in terms of what is popularly known as meditation practice, Togme Zangpo's focus, or sole focus, it appears, was that of training himself in terms of cultivating the Bodhi-mind, the mindset which aspires to attain Buddha the enlightened state in order to become able to benefit all sentient beings without a single exception. And in terms of training in the Bodhi-mind, there are numerous perspectives. We will learn about some of them in the course of the 37 practices. It seems that Togme Zangpo focused on two trainings in particular. The kind of mind training where the trainee, as it were, or the student, focuses in various ways with the aim of generating a mindset which sees all sentient beings and their happiness and progress as equally important as one's own, which then means a sense of selflessness is generated in the course of the methods of this perspective of so-called mind training. And the second point was that of developing selflessness, giving up concern for one's own welfare, and instead focus on the welfare of others, to the extent where the practitioner becomes able to exchange his own good circumstances for the suffering of others. So it's selflessness to the point where one chooses to give the good circumstances one has to another individual or to many other individuals, and instead take upon oneself their suffering. So that's a mindset of selflessness. And apparently Togme Zangpo focused in particular on these 2 points.
다 보통 A 줄라 콩의 쇼데드 A 줄라 콩의 쇼데드 다 개발 전부 제 예마 A 줄라 콩의 켄포양 망브레 디가라 콩라 셰라 퓨웅케 다 진다 몽고유서 도즈 다데 그 줄라 콩의 실로라 고 야규 실로라 방고 쪼고 제유서 되네 코랑가 칼라데 가디 이나 첸 다 인공 제기 요사마데 다 지타바서 파제체온 텐 데 공달에 공시라드 칸가 방고트 저진 페데렌도
테니 공 가레 셰여나
다 잠바도 도저도 셰기 유로 멍 데코야 칸가 코르테데렌도 방고트.
Now Togme Zangpo also having finished the education at this institution, acted as a Khenpo of the institution, he himself teaching students there. He became known as very accomplished. He earned the respect of those living in the area, and therefore many living in the area would make offerings to him, primarily of food, supplies. Now also in Old Tibet and in India today, for example, around a monastery one often finds beggars, people who go there in the hope of being given some food by the religious institution in question. And in terms of the food supplies offered to Togme Zangpo, he would very often at the end of the day, in the evening, descend from his living quarters and go out to the outside of the monastery, the area where beggars congregated, and give to them the high quality portions of the food that had been offered to him, and he himself would just eat very simply.
There was in particular
one beggar with whom he had this exchange more or less on a daily basis.
Ta ko de me du ko chik che ne chik pen do ko pa ku jo chik la de ne pe jo bu chen de yu sa de kar sa ku to lo chama da shi gap shi ge koran sen lu bo kang ga de be de ma shu den de re do then Togme Zangpo lamsang koran zem chong no ya pe kore ge na za ya ko ji yu sa de ti kang ga ko pa ku tu lo shi yu be tu lo de kang ga kore chu ye then person sare then Togme Zangpo yang yema shige sen kuzu kanga ma den de kala ka bu chung do pen da gin jet ge shang chu sem be nyam jet den na to.
Now one day apparently this beggar wasn't in the place he usually spent his day in. Togme Zangpo got worried and looked for him and found him at some distance from the monastery, looking very unwell. And so he asked the beggar what was wrong, and what had happened was that the beggar, having lived outside, had contracted fleas, and his body apparently was covered with fleas and flea bites, to the point where he had fallen ill. So Togme Zangpo brought him to his quarters, then gave him a new set of clothing. You have to put this in context. This was in the 12 or 1300s in Tibet. The 1300s, it would have been the early 1300s. And a beggar in those days was someone who would just have one set of clothing. And no possibility of getting another one if needed. Therefore, Togme Zangpo gave the beggar one of his better pieces of clothing, and he himself ended up wearing the beggar's piece of clothing that was infested with fleas, and he too was therefore subjected to, as it were, a lot of flea bites. His body as well became covered with flea bites. Dadi kända dendemachina shigden så shigden. Now one may wonder why in the modern world here most people will probably think, well, why didn't he put on one of his own pieces of clothing and throw the beggar's flea-infested piece of clothing away? Well, remember, Togme Zangpo had immersed himself in the practice of generating the Bodhi mind for the sake of benefiting all sentient beings. He probably knew fully well that if he threw that piece of clothing away, the fleas living in that piece of clothing would die a slow death out in the cold. And in order to save them from that fate of suffering, he decided to feed them with his own blood. and therefore he wore that flea-infested piece of clothing.
Tene ta pena chömi Togme Zangpo le shalom mangpo re te kong kasho nangkin pedu shik dinda pa deba nubet ringo le rida song deba nangshin shin kuzu den ro de yo sarwa so ja
Rida song deba nangshin sidi?
rig nang le rida den shik ro de ge ro rida mangpo yo sa ten nangshin shin kuzu de shik den ro ten kong tende ge ma tön tende cha gu yo sa te shalom so ge ta shik de pa chik dön chan na shun do wa a zis nge serap Togme ne ten console pa plan te go ge others ngal shik de pe misi wa ka den chen bo yin son ten de se yug do wa.
Now, in teaching sessions, it became obvious to his students that his body was covered in fleas, wandering up and down on his body. This was visible to all. There are accounts of people having said it looks as if one is viewing a mountain slope from afar, where one sees small things moving on the mountain slope in the distance. On a mountain slope you will have wild animals moving up and down. It's a bit like that, looking at our master's body. And at one point one of his students took courage and suggested to Togme Zangpo that the fleas should be removed. And Togme Zangpo is reported to have answered that, how could I ever do such a thing? These sentient beings have, in previous lives, shown me great kindness as a mother, as a father, and the like. To me, it's unthinkable to do such a thing.
Ti ta tenzo kuzu de shigla tende se nang de de ten une thane kong je sem drabo tang zan me wa tu la gating yug de yo.
He himself never displayed any sign of being upset or bothered by the flea infestation. He rather seemed as if he were taking joy in the fact that he could provide for them.
Tene tama shaku nishu tse chamne tene shikanga zosu sare shikanga shesu sare.
Now, this whole thing apparently lasted for a period of 3 weeks, at the end of which the fleas started to die off, a natural death, that is.
Tene shik rod kanga tsu druk, tene tela zonga cheparchi jangjang song, tene chama shiro ge sasatabne te jana isare.
And Togme Zangpo collected the dead fleas and recited specific mantras for their benefit, and then made tsatsas. This is a Tibetan Buddhist tradition in connection with the death of someone, in order to benefit the deceased in his next rebirth.
Tene ta ti je la tene pod ei zu la kune kung urchu rebuk said na pebadendo.
Ripukta the hermitage there.
Yeah, hermitage re, Gulchute Chedan Telare, Tanda Doja Pami Ne Chaperjin Sere, Tanda Tinsante Segadoa, Shaluk Zula Consegandoa.
Harigit Suglaka?
Shaluk Gamba Segandoa.
Shalut Suglaka.
Yeah.
Corritre de la Shalut Sulakan Segando?
Mare Gambatella.
Ola Gompaiore.
Yeah.
Now, shortly after Togme Zangpo departed from Eyi Tsuglakan to a nearby hermitage, the hermitage of Mulchu, which apparently is a place of pilgrimage associated with the Yidam Vajravari. And not far from there, the Shalut Tsugla Kangyang Sakyagi Ere. There is another Sakya monastery, Shalu Tsuglakan, or Shalu Monastery.
Oh, that la juk de pe nyong ji chap chin ji po sha. Da nyong ji de pe chen de re do dan de ba chen na ina de ji yo ba trip po ro he ji ko cancer stroke. Chap chin ji po yo sa.
Now, while at Ngulchu Hermitage, it appears that Togme Zangpo had a stroke and fell seriously ill in consequence of that.
Ta thi ka la khone ge sha she ye she pal skin jin do ye she pal ben skin
Yeshe Pal? Tene?
Ko shu ne ta ko jin na san de len em che ting bi ki per em che che ting cho was shu do ta te zan mo gos ngan de pe mi se ka den chen bo yins seram ne sa be dik pa yong che do yins ka sin de ge xia son ha ya bu shi ra re lengin ji shong ro gre song te ne te dang ma su yin ne yu de s re
Ne te?
ne te dang ma je.
Now, his attendant at the time, Yeshe Pal, suggested they would seek medical attention. Togme Zangpo said he wouldn't. He declined doing so, telling Yeshe Pal that the cause for my stroke is non-virtuous deeds in past lives, and by way of this disease I am able to reverse the otherwise unfortunate circumstances that would befall me because of those non-virtuous deeds of the past. Even if I die because of this disease, that's a good thing, because the non-virtue of the past will in this way be eradicated.
Ta ten de de ten ne nam thar ki cha she ten zo le ten ne ta min de ge da yin je to gun do jingen ni shong chup nam do cher to gun do tan de shong chup sam pang ma ren do sen de
Je she darshan je tup tene.
jingen shong chup nam do cher.
So these brief examples were given in order to make clear, to show that Togme Zangpo was a practitioner, a practicing Bodhisattva who had achieved the capacity to take upon himself the suffering of others and give to the other his own good circumstances as in the example of the beggar and his flea-infested clothing. Also, this brief example from the occasion of him having had a stroke clearly shows that he was a practitioner able to convert unfortunate circumstances into a method by way of which progress on the path can be made. He saw his disease as an instruction that can be used in the context of the path of enlightenment for the sake of progress.
Tindu Junsin Tendre Mangu, Chita Togme Zangpo ge Namtar Jebala Tendre Mangu Shirayore. Tendre Tenne, Pearl Yongra ke Gyalse Rinpoche and Kong Toson de Yu.
Gyalse Rinpoche.
Ya, Gyalse Poshonchup Sampa Segiorwa. Mang Chao ke Tu Tata in Gyalse Rinpoche song, Gyalse Rinpoche song Sedigdoa. What's our theory?
Now, these are very brief examples from his life. There are extensive biographies where many, many more details are found. And Togme Zangpo at the time and afterwards, in the light of his life example, became known as Gyalse Rinpoche, which means precious son of the victorious ones. And that's the name he's usually known by in terms of Tibetan Buddhism.
Tegan Nashinge Tamale Ulchurabu de Jobu Kabla, Tagono Dunchu Tonga Hedu, Tekusha Ye Nonjipo, Takusha Sare Sansum Chayo Sare. Shall do Lotagaran Resha, then the Kongoloma, Tajin Shujure, Ye Palchunke de Shune, Tache Shan Shado Sare, Nancho so at them not, Che Tagushinkam Kana Peggyins, Kawaso at them Gores, Country Jundoa. Semjin la pain mato nane, not dogwishing come there and romance. Semjin the pain tobachin nane, Yalen on the pond of Monum Jaguars. Yal with Semjin la pain tona, and Yarwar with Monum Jaguars. Dorna, Chisi drove a tamazo pardo, Tessi to Madagwishin and Madagwishin to Javan, Semjin get paint out to a jaggy matongar dogwishing the rome somewhat.
Riva me yang mena peggy me so
Pegme sonto.
Now tene matong batu ngulchu pug de la shugde. Now towards the end of his life, for a period of time, Togme Zangpo stayed at Ngulshu Hermitage, apparently in terms of what's in between the time of the examples just given and the end of his life, he may have lived and worked in other places. But at the end of his life, and apparently that's where he passed away, he was at the Ngulshu Hermitage. It became clear to those around him at one point that his passing was probably not very far away. And therefore, some of his disciples approached him, asking him which pure land, as it were, he would go to upon his death, where he would reside, which pure land he would reside in upon his death, as it were. Simply because, as they said, they would want to know which pure land to focus upon when praying to him, their master. Now, Ngulche Togme apparently had answered them, there is no certainty with respect to where I will be after this life, whether in a pure land or in a worldly existence. My focus is that of manifesting again and again in impure world systems for the sake of benefiting those trapped there. I may be found in a hellish existence or any other type of worldly existence rather than a pure land, because in those existences I can truly benefit those trapped in unfortunate circumstances. Apparently, in terms of his passing, the year of his passing is 1369. And in terms of the text that will be taught during this series of lectures, it is the text mentioned earlier, mentioned by Togme Zangpo, what a Bodhisattva does in 37 practices. Hermitage la
Yedu Koran le saye kunye kan yeba de jimbatang na ja gyu saro te konre de she me ba ji chong do palam ji la
tene
ta kong lo ma ka she dan de che zan hong sa ma de do ze tene wang gu ye chwa ga den ye ten zo la jong che la lin la ten zo la lin de do zhen ro dan zhong na shi yun do nga shongchup tönde nyerbe mechi yins shongchup tönye la lalin de zogod
chungtul me chungtul gi kong pa ni me chungchup
de
dönyer gemi
yin
laso
charanzo shongchup tönde nyerna lalin de la labgore se tenzin sun sobdent songdo.
Now, on one occasion, while living at the Ngulchu hermitage, apparently at one point there were hardly any food supplies or access to new clothing, simply because whatever offerings had been given, Ngulche Togme had immediately distributed these offerings to those in need. Therefore, his disciples, who also lived there, approached him at one point and asked, or suggested rather, that perhaps the master could perform empowerments, set up a teaching program for learning rituals and so on, that would attract people who would give offerings so that the master and the disciples wouldn't run out of supplies and the difficulties that involved. Apparently, Togme Zangpo had answered that I'm a man who makes efforts to attain enlightenment. That's my goal. And for that to be possible, one needs to do the following. And then he had given the 37 practices recorded in the text that Khenpo Rinpoche will explain during the next series of teachings.
Per nange lalin sodem age derbate tanda pechot me derbate keon sembado jege debete ne makami shubiye derbate te keon sembado jinde sondo one terwa konge dagjin jeve namtartan
Togme Zangpo gi dashen
jeve number tarwa
dashen
Jing Shongchup to Cherven Namtar Drove Tenla Mönam Tebetsul
Drove Densosum
Tensosum
Mönam Tebetsul
Tene Ta Shongchup Sembaji Che Gona Laling Kartar Gobiba Laling Sodema set, Tanda Laling in the Shimba.
Re Dina Sempajiki Dashen Jeve Namtar, Kiengen Chanshuki Lam to Cherve Namtar Tang, Drove Merlam Tepsul Sum, Dang Sodun Ma Delva Kande Chegoring.
Lak Lin said. Kesi Shongchup Drubachina, O Ninjum Lalin, this or check or a mato, Chick Lobjon Chenandra, Karchenandra, Namchusuma so much.
Da Dirava, then so soon Togme Zangpo la Kogo Grava.
Said
Tene then so soon you can give me tea, Lalen Sodun ma. Sungdu de Chanshup Sempelam Ngoma Yimpa Drugiore Drugju Karedu de Sungdan Sobdun
Gala in this song taken on Drebena. Namtan the Chahe, Langazo Tebachi Jero Chena, teaching Sabanji Teb Grace. Korang Rewat de Redoa.
Tene Sempajigi Mepara.
Ready, this Sempajigi Nanzun.
Dangpo then so Tang Sobdunigi Bala Kandechik
That
connection Chigo.
So then the connection Derawa. Perna Nanzo Lobjon Chena Indra, Chick Chena the Mang, Chevaching Mamchure do Yaroa.
Da Lalen Sobdun Mate Sompe Migulte Ngomche Mare. Carre Sena Kongtu Shepe Yuntun Sum Jöne di hako tog resung gör vi.
Mare.
Ona.
Tangaran din dan samar shasha.
Mare.
Didn't do. Pen chu karan labate, ngarang ke la tu ne re mato. Ki ngam chu sun ro mini ma je dam do.
Det där hakoger, vad sikten så hakoger, det ni kan det shit drill går det, drill min du va?
This sum ka te phawa thom di yika te thome ge nam thar rawa.
Den så sumdan lallen sodima.
Lallen sigel.
Ja, lallen sodima.
Ja, da te kanga te Togme Zangpo nam thar rawa.
Re?
Nam thar tin chu cha she la ngan jo sam tang ne. Sem yu la Shanchu sem sengkendel goachil le rochana. Teaching rikse bala pengre song do hadala.
Now, in terms of a commentary to the 37 practices, Khenpo Rinpoche is basing his explanations on a commentary authored by the accomplished scholar and practitioner Senpa Dorje. Who, in his introduction, I presume, says that anyone aspiring to the path of a bodhisattva, anyone aspiring to practice the path of a bodhisattva could, in consequence of considering the life example of Togme Zangpo, and as we have seen, he practiced the path of a bodhisattva to the point where he could actually exchange his own circumstances, good circumstances, for the difficult circumstances of others, as in the example of the beggar with the flea-infested clothing. Togme Zangpo happily wore the flea-infested piece of clothing in order to save the lives of these fleas, so that they could live out their lives and die a natural death, because of him providing the blood of his body for them to feed off till they died naturally, rather than discarding with that piece of clothing and them starving to death. So that is just one of the many examples in terms of the life example of Togme Zangpo, where it was perfectly clear that Togme Zangpo was a person able to actually take upon himself the suffering of others and give them good circumstances. Then there is the second perspective, where we also saw, by way of an example earlier, that he was able to incorporate very difficult circumstances, such as that of his stroke and the resulting difficulties. He was able to simply make that part of his path to enlightenment. So the unfavorable conditions did not become a problem. They rather resulted in him making progress on the path to enlightenment. And also there is the perspective of his great aspirations in terms of benefiting others, as demonstrated in the example of what he told his disciples when it became clear that his passing, his death wasn't far away, namely that he would simply continue to take rebirths in worldly existences, because there, according to his thought, there would be the best opportunities for truly benefiting others, rather than residing in a so-called pure land. So we can see that Togme Zangpo was truly someone who had taken the instructions of the path of a bodhisattva to heart. And as we also saw, it was in one of these contexts that he set forth the 37 practices that we will find in the text that is to be taught during this series of lectures. Now, Sempa Dorje, the author of the commentary to the 37 practices, says in his introductory marks that his hope in writing this commentary is that it will help those interested in practicing the Bodhisattva path to awaken the so-called inner potential of the greater vehicle, Mahayana Buddhism, which is to say the Bodhi mind. That the explanations he gives in the commentary to the text and the text itself will help prospective practitioners to awaken to the great potential within in terms of making progress on the path to enlightenment, so that sentient beings can truly be benefited.
Penna lojong de danga sentient tenkin la lama khundra chi gore ma to nga dang ngan ra chi ke lojong shekat de zemu se so chi chapre
Togme Zangpo songyo.
Togme Zangpo ra chi ke ta lojong chi soma yin na ngone rang yu le lojong yo ra wa.
Yeah.
Nga dang ngan ra chi she tu rang yu le lojong me de zemu se de so chi ro wa.
Now there is a set of teachings named mind training. It's rather extensive. Just an additional remark. There seems sometimes to be the idea that mind training is about just 7 points or something like that. No, this is not the case. There is a set of mind training teachings that involves over 100 points and so on and so forth. So-called mind training is a very, very extensive topic. Anyway, Khenpo Rinpoche says, in terms of receiving teachings on mind training, in his view, it's preferable to receive those teachings, instructions, and explanations from a master who embodies those teachings, a master who has realized those teachings. He goes on to say, Khenpo Rinpoche goes on to say that he does not see himself as such an individual who has made progress to that extent. Therefore, in terms of teaching the path of the Bodhisattva, his choice is that of this text with its 37 practices set forth by someone, a master who had realized those teachings. He says that he says that he sees himself as a person who, on his own, in an attempt of explaining the path of a bodhisattva and its practices, his explanations would rather be like a child's play or a joke, and that's in that he is not at the level he deems necessary for expounding those teachings. Therefore, for this series of lectures, he has chosen to give explanations on this text authored by Ngulchu Togme.
Togme Zangpo ge nang tang ten zo le Jesu yirong che ne ngaran so tin rawa che maung pa na lak to be ge manam yang ne yang de du ta dan jön gu rang ge nyam nin le de je tu ba che.
So Khenpo Rinpoche says that he himself and all of you, we should all aspire to, at some time in the future, become a master of those teachings, like Togme Zangpo, that this should be our goal in terms of our aspirations.
Lasso. Sunam de ye tamje zakba nye tomne nye be danam pamje jega na je balab chuwa ye sikbe cholen do shu shanjub semsho rinpoche maje panam je jure je ba nyamba me ba dang kone kangdo pe war